The mud of Purgatory Creek was not merely earth and water, it was a living, malevolent thing. It was a slurry of freezing slush, pig manure, and the accumulated misery of 100 souls who had come west looking for gold and found only grey skies and dysentery. It sucked at Ada Blackwood's boots with a wet, flat sound, threatening to pull her down into the filth where her husband, Jebediah Rourke, seemed to think she belonged. Ada kept her head down, her chin tucked deep into the collar of her threadbare wool coat. The coat was 3 sizes too big, a cast-off from a dead miner that smelled of damp mold and old sweat, but it was the only shield she had against the biting wind that whipped down from the Teton Peaks. The wind didn't just chill the skin, it rattled the bones. "Move, you useless sow!" Jebediah roared, yanking on the rough hemp rope he had tied around her waist. The knot dug into her hip bone, chafing skin that had never had time to heal from. The last bruise. Ada stumbled, her hand flying out to catch herself on the railing of the stockyard corral. A splinter the size of a needle drove into her palm, but she didn't cry out. She had learned long ago that noise only invited a heavier hand. She was 28 years old, but in the reflection of the horse troughs, she looked 50. Her hair, once the color of spun wheat, was matted and hidden under a stained bonnet. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over cheekbones that spoke of hunger, both for food and for kindness. "Step up," Jebediah hissed, shoving her toward the center of the corral. A crowd had gathered. They were men mostly, trappers, miners and cattle drivers who smelled of wet dogs and cheap whiskey. They lined the fence rails, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats and the thick curtains of tobacco smoke that drifted in the freezing air. They weren't here for a woman, they were here for livestock. But in Purgatory Creek, on a Friday afternoon, entertainment was scarce and cruelty was free. Jebediah dragged Ada onto an overturned crate in the center of the muck. He stood beside her, a small rat-faced man with eyes that watered constantly from gin and spite. He raised his arms, playing to the crowd like a carnival barker. "Gentlemen," he shouted, his voice cracking, "I stand before you a man of bad luck. I bought a mare 10 years ago thinking she'd drop me a foal every spring, but look at her." He grabbed Ada's jaw with a dirty hand, wrenching her face up to the grey light. "Dry," Jebediah spat. "Barren as the salt flats. 10 years I've fed. Her! 10 years I've housed her. And not one son to show for it. Her womb is full of dust and cobwebs." Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a low, ugly sound, like stones grinding together. Ada closed her eyes. The shame was a physical heat, burning her cheeks despite the freezing rain. Barren. The word was branded on her soul. She believed it. She felt the emptiness inside her like a hollow cave where the wind howled. She was broken machinery. A field that grew only rocks. "But," Jebediah continued, releasing her face to slap her hard on the shoulder, "she ain't useless. Look at those hands, calloused, strong. She can pull a plow better than an ox. She eats less than a mule. She don't talk back, and she don't cry." He held up the end of the rope. "I'm auctioning her off, not as a wife. God forbid you take this curse into your bed, but as a mule, a 2-legged mule who can scrub your floors and skin your deer. $2, a voice shouted from the back. "She got teeth?" another yelled. "Open your mouth," Jebediah commanded. When Ada hesitated, paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of the humiliation, Jebediah raised his hand. She flinched, opening her mouth. "Good teeth," Jebediah preened. "Strongback. Who'll give me 10? $10 for a lifetime of labor, cheaper than a horse and lasts twice as long." A clod of mud flew from the crowd, striking Ada in the chest. It splattered against her cheek. She stood frozen, the mud sliding down her face like a tear she refused to shed. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. $5, a toothless trapper yelled, stepping forward. "I need someone to carry my pelts. If she dies on the trail, I ain't out much." "5? Jebediah scoffed, though his eyes lit up. "She's worth at least 8. Look at the hips, wide enough to carry a keg of water on each side." The crowd laughed harder. The cruelty was escalating, feeding on itself. Someone reached through the rails and poked Ada with a cattle prod. She gasped, shrinking away, only to be jerked back by the rope around her waist. Then the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, heavy thudding that silenced the laughter instantly. The crowd at the gate parted. They didn't just move, they scrambled back, pressing themselves against the fence rails as if escaping a fire. A horse entered the corral. It was a Percheron draft horse, black as a coal seam and standing 18 hands high. Its hooves were the size of dinner plates, splashing through the mud with terrified power. Steam billowed from its nostrils in great white clouds, but it was the rider who sucked the air out of the yard, Caleb Thorne. They called him Grizzly, in the saloons, but never to his face. He was a giant of a man, wrapped in a coat made from the pelt of a silver-tipped grizzly bear, the claws still attached and clicking against his saddle. His head was covered by a battered hat, pulled low, but beneath the brim, a beard as thick and dark as iron wool hid his face. Only his eyes were visible, pale, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. He rode into the center of the corral. The Percheron halted inches from the crate where Ada stood. The beast towered over her, its hot breath misting over her head. Caleb sat motionless. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Jebediah. He looked at Ada. He looked at the mud on her face. He looked at the rope cutting into her waist. He looked at the hollow emptiness in her eyes, the look of an animal that has stopped fighting the trap. Jebediah swallowed hard. His bravado flickered and died. He knew who this was. Everyone knew. Thorne lived above the timberline, in the jagged peaks where the air was too thin for Christian men. Rumor said he had killed a man with his bare hands for kicking a dog. Mr. Thorne, Jebediah stammered, holding the rope tighter. We was just conducting business, a trade. Caleb slowly turned his head. The leather of his saddle creaked. Business, Caleb repeated. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the wet air like distant thunder. It wasn't a question. Yes, Jebediah said, trying to find his spine. Selling off livestock. She's barren, you see. Useless for breeding. But she works hard. I was asking $8. Caleb looked at the rope in Jebediah's hand. Then he looked at the mud at Jebediah's feet. He reached into his saddlebag. His hand was massive, wrapped in a glove made of buckskin that was stained dark with old grease and blood. He pulled out a pouch. It was heavy leather, bulging at the seams. He didn't hand it to Jebediah. He dropped it. Thud. The pouch hit the mud with the heavy, dead sound of solid metal. It didn't bounce, it sank. 50 ounces, Caleb growled. Gold dust. A collective gasp went through the crowd. 50 ounces was a fortune. It was enough to buy the saloon, the livery, and every horse in it. Jebediah's eyes bulged. He looked at the bag, then at Caleb. Greed overtook his fear. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the mud to grab the pouch. 50, Jebediah squeaked. For her, for the mule, Caleb corrected, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a lethal whisper. And for you to never speak her name again. If I hear you breathe the word Ada in this territory, I will come back for the change. Jebediah clutched the gold to his chest, nodding frantically. Sold! Sold to the man on the beast! Take her! She's yours! Good riddance! He scrambled backward, away from the horse, clutching his fortune. Caleb turned back to Ada. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand. She stared at the giant on the horse. He paid a fortune, she thought, her mind reeling in terror. Why? What does he want? A slave? A toy to break? Caleb reached down. A massive knife appeared in his hand, a bowie blade with a staghorn handle. Ada flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the cut. Snap. The rope around her waist fell away. Caleb had severed it with a single surgical stroke, missing her coat by a fraction of an inch. Give me your hand, he commanded. Ada looked up. She looked at the gloved hand hovering in front of her face. It was scarred and terrifying, but it was open. She had no choice. She was property. The deed had transferred. She reached out. Her hand, small and red with cold, disappeared into his. He didn't pull. He lifted. With effortless strength, he swung her up. She landed behind him on the broad rump of the Percheron. The horse shifted, but held steady. "Hold the belt," Caleb rumbled. Ada wrapped her arms around his waist. The bear fur was coarse and smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and something wilder. Musk and blood. It was a terrifying scent, but it was warm. For the first time in hours, she felt heat. Caleb kicked the horse. The beast surged forward, splashing mud onto Jebediah Rourke, who was still kneeling in the filth counting his gold. They didn't look back. They rode out of the corral, past the silent, staring men, and turned toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Tetons. Ada buried her face in the fur of the stranger's coat, tears finally freezing on her cheeks, terrified of the monster who had bought her and grieving for the life she had just lost, even if that life had been a living hell. She was a barren mule, and she was being taken to the top of the world to work until she died. Gemini said, "The ascent into the Teton Range was a journey not through distance, but through layers of atmosphere, each one colder and more hostile than the last. The slush of Purgatory Creek hardened into a crust of grey ice, and then, as the Percheron climbed the switchbacks with heaving flanks, into a dry, stinging powder that hissed across the rocks like sand. Ada Blackwood clung to the waist of the stranger, her face buried in the coarse fur of his coat. She had ceased to feel her toes miles ago. Her fingers, locked in a rigor of fear and cold around his belt, felt like foreign objects, brittle twigs that might snap if she tried to move them. The wind up here was a physical weight, a shrieking banshee that tried to tear them from the saddle and hurl them into the abyss that yawned to their left, a drop so deep the pine trees at the bottom looked like moss. She was waiting to die. She assumed that was the destination. Men didn't buy barren mules to keep them as pets. He would work her until she froze, or until the horse needed meat. She was simply a resource, moving from one ledger to another. The giant in front of her shifted. He pulled on the reins, bringing the massive horse to a halt on a ridge, exposed to the full fury of the gale. "Down," Caleb growled. His voice vibrated through his back and into her chest. Ada scrambled to obey, terrified of angering him. Her legs hit the ground and instantly buckled. She collapsed into a snowdrift, the powder biting her skin. She tried to stand, but her body was a block of ice. Caleb dismounted. He landed with a heavy thud, the sound of a falling tree. He looked down at her. In the twilight, his silhouette was terrifying, broad as a barn door, darker than the storm. He reached for the clasps of his coat. Ada flinched, curling into a ball in the snow. Here it comes, she thought. The beating, or worse. But no blow came. Instead, a heavy, warm weight fell over her. Caleb had stripped off the grizzly bear coat, the only thing standing between him and the sub-zero wind, and dropped it onto her. "Put it on," he commanded. Ada stared up at him, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would crack. He stood there in nothing but a buckskin shirt and trousers, the wind whipping his long hair across his face. He was exposing himself to death to cover her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Frozen mules don't work," Caleb snapped, turning back to the horse to check the cinch. "And I paid 50 ounces. I ain't losing my investment. To frostbite." Ada pulled the coat around her. It was immense. It swallowed her whole, dragging in the snow. But it was hot. It held his body heat, a furnace-like warmth that smelled of tobacco, pine resin, and man. She huddled inside it, confused. Jebediah would have let her freeze before risking a cough himself. This man, this monster, was protecting his property with his own skin. They rode for another hour, Caleb shivering visibly now, his muscles bunched tight against the cold, until they reached the timberline. The cabin was not a house. It was a fortification. Built directly into the granite face of a sheer cliff, the back wall was the mountain itself. The logs were black with age and pitch, thick as wine barrels, chinked with river clay and moss. A stone chimney, massive and squat, hugged the side, though no smoke rose from it now. It looked abandoned, a dead thing clinging to the rock. Caleb practically fell from the horse, his limbs stiff. He grabbed Ada by the scruff of the bear coat, like a mother cat grabbing a kitten, and hauled her toward the door. He kicked it open. The air inside was stale and freezing, smelling of dust, cold ash, and the musk of old furs. It was pitch black. "Stay," Caleb rasped. He moved into the darkness. Ada stood by the door, drowning in the heavy coat, listening to the sounds of his survival. The strike of a lucifer match, the hiss of a lantern, the clatter of wood being shoved into a stove. Light flared. The cabin revealed itself. It was a single, cavernous room, dominated by the hearth. The walls were hung with the tools of death, steel traps with jagged teeth, rifles of various calibers, knives with bone handles. Piles of furs lay in the corners. A rough-hewn table sat in the center, buried under a drift of dirty tin plates, coffee grounds and disassembled gun parts. It was a bachelor's den, chaotic and grim. Caleb turned to her. His face was blue with cold, his beard frosted white. He pointed a shaking finger at a pile of buffalo robes on a raised wooden frame in the corner, the only bed. "Sleep," he grunted. He walked to the hearth, grabbed a blanket from a pile on the taps floor, and wrapped it around his shoulders. He sat heavily on a three-legged stool, shivering violently as he fed the fire. Ada didn't move. She stood by the door, the bear coat pooling around her feet. Where is the plough?" she asked. Her voice was small, thin as a reed. Caleb stopped stoking the fire. He turned his head slowly, looking at her over his shoulder. The firelight caught the deep scars on his face, 3 parallel lines running from his temple to his jaw, the mark of the grizzly that had given him his coat and his name. "The what?" he rumbled. "The plough," Ada repeated, trembling. "Jebediah said he sold me as a mule, to pull the plough. Do you want me to start now? In the snow?" She looked at the floor. Or do I sleep in the barn with the horse?" Caleb stared. At her. He looked at the woman who was so broken, so conditioned to cruelty, that she expected to be harnessed to a yoke in the middle of a blizzard. He felt a sharp, twisting pain in his gut that had nothing to do with the cold. "There ain't no plough," Caleb growled, turning back to the fire to hide the expression on his face. "Ground's frozen rock. Nothing grows here." "Then why?" Ada whispered. "Why did you pay?" Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't tell her he paid because he couldn't stand the sight of her in the mud. He couldn't tell her he paid because her eyes looked like the eyes of a doe he had once trapped and had to kill to end its misery. He was a hard man. Hard men didn't have reasons like that. "I need the cabin kept," he lied, his voice rough. "I trap. I hunt. I ain't got time to scrub pots. You sleep in the bed. I sleep on the floor." "The floor," Ada blinked. "But you're the master." "I'm the one with the gun," Caleb snapped, his patience fraying under the weight of her submissiveness. "And I say you take the bed. Now get out of my coat before you smother." He stood up, grabbed his rifle, and walked to the door. "I have to." "See to the horse," he muttered. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anything that doesn't sound like me." The door slammed. The heavy bar thudded into place. Ada was alone. She stood in the center of the room, shivering as the heat from the bear coat faded. She looked at the bed. It was soft. It was raised off the floor. It was a place for a person, not a mule. She didn't take it. She couldn't. It felt like a trap. Instead, she looked around the room. The chaos was overwhelming. The floor was gritty with pine needles and dried mud. The table was a disaster. The air smelled of neglect. She knew this smell. It was the smell of a man who had stopped caring if he lived or died and was just waiting for the mountain to take him. Ada took a breath. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a mother. She was a barren mule. But a mule had to work to earn its feed. Work was safety. If she was useful, he wouldn't beat her. If she was useful, he wouldn't turn her out into the snow. She took off the heavy coat and folded it neatly on the bench. She rolled up the sleeves of her oversized wool dress. She found a bucket. She melted snow on the stove. She found a rag that was stiff with grease and boiled it until it was pliable. She began to scrub. She scrubbed the table until the wood turned from gray to honey gold. She gathered the scattered gun parts and lined them up in perfect rows, size by size. She swept the floor with a bundle of twigs, gathering the dust into the fire. She moved to the larder shelves. They were a mess, sacks of flour spilling, tins of coffee overturned. She organized them as she reached for a sack of beans on the bottom shelf. Her hand brushed against something loose, a floorboard. It wobbled. Curiosity, a dangerous thing she thought she had beaten out of herself, flared. She pried the board up with her fingernails. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small box. Ada opened it. Her breath hitched. Inside were toys, tiny wooden figures carved with exquisite, heartbreaking detail. A horse rearing on its hind legs. A wolf howling at the moon. A tiny cradle, no bigger than a matchbox, with a rocker that actually moved. They were smooth as glass, sanded to perfection. The work of hands that were patient, gentle. Ada picked up the cradle. She ran her thumb over the tiny rockers. A barren mule, she thought, a tear leaking from her eye, and a monster who carves cradles. She put the box back. She replaced the board. She felt like she had intruded on a grave. She went back to work. She found a piece of dried venison and some wrinkled potatoes. She put them in a pot with water and a pinch of salt she found in a crock. She set it on the stove. Hours passed. The storm howled outside, shaking the heavy timbers of the roof. But inside, the cabin began to change. The smell of dust faded, replaced by the savory scent of broth and the clean smell of wet wood. The door latch lifted. Ada froze, wiping her hands on her apron. She backed into the corner, making herself small. Caleb entered. He was covered in snow, looking like a yeti. He carried the saddlebags over his shoulder. He stopped dead in the doorway. He blinked. The floor was clean, the table was clear. The fire was roaring, banking perfectly against the back of the chimney. The smell of stew hit him like a physical blow. He looked at Ada. She was standing in the shadows, her head bowed, waiting for judgment. He looked at the bed. It was empty. The furs were fluffed and stacked, but unslept in. "I told you to sleep." Caleb rumbled, kicking the snow from his boots. I earned my keep," Ada whispered. "The stew is ready, Mr. Thorne." Caleb walked to the table. He ran a finger over the clean wood. He looked at the gun parts, organized better than he ever did it. He looked at the floorboard where the toys were hidden. It looked undisturbed. He relaxed slightly. He walked to the stove. He dipped a ladle into the pot and tasted the broth. It was simple, but it was hot. It was food. He turned to her. He didn't smile. His face seemed incapable of it. But the hardness around his eyes softened. Just a fraction. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the stool. "I can stand," Ada said. "I'll eat after you." "Sit," Caleb barked, the volume making her jump. "I ain't eating alone like a dog. And my name is Caleb, not Mr. Thorne, not Master." Ada sat. She perched. On the edge of the stool, trembling, Caleb filled 2 bowls. He set one in front of her. He handed her a spoon. "Eat," he said. "You're too skinny to pull a plow anyway." He sat on a crate opposite her. He ate with the hunger of a wolf, but he watched her over the rim of his bowl. He watched the way she held the spoon like it was precious. He watched the way she flinched when the wind slammed against the door. He realized then that he hadn't just bought a woman. He had brought a terrified, broken bird into a bear's den. And as the warmth of the cabin settled around them, Caleb Thorne felt a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion stirring in his chest. The urge to not just protect her from the cold, but to warm her up. The blizzard that descended on the Teton Range was not merely a storm. It was a living, breathing malice of the mountain. It began as a low moan in the valley, a vibration in the floorboards that made the tin cups on the shelf rattle, before exploding into a white-out fury that erased the world. For 3 days, the cabin shuddered under the assault. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the shingles, piling snow against the north wall until the window was nothing but a grey, opaque square of ice. Inside, the air grew heavy and close, the smell of wood smoke turning acrid as the chimney struggled to draw against the downdraft. Caleb had been restless all day. He had paced the small floor, checking the bar on the door, checking the shutters, checking the rifles. He moved with a heavy, dragging gait that Ada hadn't noticed before. He was sweating despite the draft that snaked across the floorboards. "Caleb?" Ada asked from her chair by the fire, where she was mending a tear in his spare shirt. "You're dripping." "Fire's too hot," Caleb grunted. He turned away from her, shrugging his massive shoulders as if to dislodge a weight. He grabbed the water. "Bucket!" It was empty. "I'll fetch snow to melt," he rasped. He reached for the door latch. He missed. His hand swiped clumsily at the wood. He swayed like a great pine whose roots had finally snapped. "Caleb!" Ada dropped the shirt. He didn't answer. His knees buckled. The impact of his body hitting the floor shook the entire cabin. The water bucket clattered away, rolling into the shadows. Ada was beside him in a heartbeat. She turned him over. He was burning. The heat radiating from him was terrifying, a dry, feverish fire that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. His skin was grey beneath the beard, and his eyes were rolled back, showing the whites. "No," Ada whispered, panic fluttering in her throat. "Not now, not in the storm." She grabbed his hand. It was scorching. She pushed up the sleeve of his shirt. Nothing. She checked his other arm. Nothing. She ripped open the front of his buckskin shirt. There, on his left side, just below the ribs, was the enemy. It was a set of 4 deep parallel gouges, claw marks. They were old, maybe a week, but they had turned angry and septic. The flesh around them was swollen tight and shiny, radiating streaks of poison that were tracking toward his heart. A cougar swipe he had hidden, stitched up poorly himself, and ignored in his arrogance to be the protector. "You stubborn mule," Ada hissed, tears pricking her eyes. "You prideful, stupid man." She didn't have time to be afraid. She didn't have time to worry about being useless. If she didn't act, the mountain would claim him before morning. She ran to the larder. She grabbed the willow bark she had seen in the jar. She grabbed the dried yarrow. She grabbed the whiskey bottle. She dragged the heavy iron kettle to the fire. She filled it with the last of the water in the pitcher. She returned to him. He was too heavy to move to the bed. She would have to nurse him on the floor, on the bearskin. "Rug, Caleb," she said, slapping his cheek lightly. "Wake up, you have to drink." He groaned, thrashing his head from side to side. "The ice," he mumbled, his voice thick and delirious. "Sarah, don't let go. The ice is too thin." Ada froze. Sarah, a name she didn't know, a ghost from the past. The woman the toys were for. "Shh," she soothed, lifting his heavy head into her lap. "There's no ice here, only fire." She forced the willow bark tea between his lips. He choked, coughed, but swallowed. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged outside, and Ada fought a war inside. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. She became a creature of constant motion. She changed the poultices on his wound every hour, flinching at the smell of corruption but never stopping. She bathed his forehead with cool snowmelt she gathered by cracking the door just an inch. She held him down when the fever dreams made him thrash and fight invisible demons. She wasn't the Barren Mule of the auction block. She wasn't the cursed wife. She was the keeper of the flame. She was the barrier between the man and the dark. She saw his body. the scars that mapped a life of violence and survival. She saw the vulnerability of the giant when he was stripped of his strength. She saw the man beneath the legend, and her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, began to ache for him. "Sarah," he whispered, clutching Ada's wrist in the middle of the night, his grip bruising. "The baby. Is he breathing? Did he cry?" Ada's breath hitched. A baby. The toys under the floorboards made sense now. The cradle. "He's safe." Ada lied, stroking his sweat-dampened hair. "Sleep now, Caleb." "I tried," Caleb wept, tears leaking from his closed eyes. "I tried to save them. The blood. Too much blood." He wasn't talking about a fight. He was talking about a birth that went wrong. Ada understood then, the solitude, the anger, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking. He wasn't a monster. He was a man haunting himself, living in a tomb he built for a family that died. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his hot shoulder. "You are not alone," she whispered. "I am here. The mule is here." On the fourth morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The sun, weak and pale, filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Caleb opened his eyes. The delirium was gone. The pale blue was clear, though exhausted. He lay still, listening to the crackle of the fire. He felt the pain in his side, a dull throb now, not the sharp agony of poison. He felt the cool cloth on his head. He turned his head. Ada was sitting on the floor beside him, her back against the woodbox. She was asleep, her head lolling on her chest. Her face was grey with exhaustion, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. Her hands, stained with herbs and soot, lay open in her lap. Caleb tried to sit up. A groan escaped him. Ada's eyes snapped open. She was awake instantly, scrambling to her knees. "Caleb?" She reached for his forehead. "Are you with me?" Caleb caught her wrist. His grip was weak, shaking, but his skin was cool. The fever had broken. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice was a wreck, like gravel in a grinder. "Where would I go?" Ada asked softly, checking his pulse. "The storm buried us." "You could have let me die," Caleb said. He looked at the bandage on his side. "Cougar. 4 days ago. Thought I could sweat it out. It almost killed you," Ada scolded gently. "If I hadn't found the yarrow." She stopped. She pulled her hand back. She looked down at her lap. "I thought you would be angry," she whispered. "That I touched you. That I took charge." Caleb looked at her. He saw the strength in her shoulders. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He saw the woman who had scrubbed his floor and saved his life. "Why?" he asked. "Because I am useful," Ada blurted out, the old defense rising automatically. "I can nurse. I can cook. I earned my keep, Caleb. You can't throw me out. I saved you." Caleb frowned. He struggled to push himself up on one elbow. "Throw you out? Is that what you think this is?" "I am Barren," Ada said, the shame spilling over in the quiet cabin. She turned her head, hiding her face. "Jebediah sold me because I'm a dead field. I know why you bought me. You need a worker. But a worker who can't give you a son isn't worth 50 ounces of gold." She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I heard you. In the fever. You called for Sarah. You called for the baby." Caleb went still. The mention of the names was like a knife in his gut. "Sarah was my wife," he said, his voice hollow. "She died 5 years ago. In this bed. Birthing a son who died with her." He looked at the floorboards where the toys were hidden. "I carved the cradle," he whispered. "I carved the horse. I was ready to be a father. And God took it all." He looked back at Ada. "You think you're broken because you didn't give Rourke a child?" Ada nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I am dry land, Caleb. Nothing grows in me." Caleb reached out. His hand, heavy and scarred, hovered near her face. Ada flinched. She expected him to push her away. She expected disgust. He didn't touch her hair. He didn't touch her shoulder. He cupped her cheek. His calloused thumb wiped away the tear. He touched the skin that Jebediah had slapped 1,000 times. "Ada," Caleb whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He leaned closer, ignoring the pain in his side. "A garden ain't barren just 'cause it was planted with salt," he said softly. Ada's eyes widened. "What?" "Rourke was poison," Caleb said. "He was the salt. He was the rot. You ain't dry land, Ada. You just needed better soil." He looked deep into her eyes, brown and warm and terrified. "I ain't looking for a broodmare," he said. "I was looking for someone to keep the cold out." "And you?" He squeezed her cheek gently. "You brought the fire back." Ada let out a sob, a sound of pure, fracturing relief. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes, feeling the warmth of his palm against her skin. "I'm not broken," she whispered. "No," Caleb breathed. "You're just waiting for the spring." He let his hand drop to the fur, exhausted by the effort, but the distance between them had vanished. The air in the cabin was no longer charged with fear or suspicion. It was charged with something else, a quiet, terrified understanding that they were no longer fighting the winter alone. They were two broken things that, when placed together, might just make something whole. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The spring thaw did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the violent, cracking groan of the earth waking up from a 6-month coma. The silence of the deep winter, which had cocooned Ada and Caleb in a fragile, healing peace, was shattered by the roar of the creek. Swollen with black meltwater and sludge, it tore through the ravine below the cabin like a gouge in the mountain, carrying boulders the size of wagons in its frothing jaw. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of two people trapped in a wooden lung. It was heavy with moisture, smelling of wet wool, damp earth, and the sharp green scent of pine resin warming in the sun. Caleb sat on the heavy oak bench near the door, his legs stretched out stiffly. The cougar wound in his side had healed into an angry, knotted pucker of scar tissue that pulled tight every time the barometric pressure dropped, but the infection was gone. He was cleaning his rifle, a heavy Sharps buffalo gun that fired a cartridge the size of a man's thumb. Scrape, oil, click. The rhythm was soothing, but his eyes were not. They were fixed on the window, watching the steam rise from the melting snow in the yard. His instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of solitude, were screaming. The jays had stopped scolding in the spruce trees. The squirrels had vanished. Ada was at the hearth. She was humming, a low, hesitant sound that she was still learning to use. She was kneading dough for biscuits, her hands flour-dusted and strong. She wasn't the skeletal ghost Caleb had bought in the mud. Her cheeks had filled out, flushed with the heat of the fire and the steady diet of venison stew. She stopped kneading. Her hands hovered over the board. She turned to him. "Caleb?" "Quiet," he rasped, raising a hand. He stood up, ignoring the twinge in his side. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into the dim, grey twilight of the overcast morning. "Get away from the fire," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Get to the corner, behind the woodbox." "What is it?" Ada whispered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mud," Caleb said. "Boots in the mud. Too many of them." He moved to the window, peering through the crack in the heavy shutter. Down in the yard, emerging from the mist like wraiths of dirty smoke, were 6 riders. They were picking their way up the treacherous, slushy path, their horses blowing hard in the thin air. Leading them, riding a sway-backed mare that looked as mean as its master, was Jebediah Rourke. He looked worse than Ada remembered. His coat was stained with months of tobacco juice and vomit. His face was a map of broken veins and desperation. He had spent the 50 ounces of gold, spent it on whiskey, cards, and women who stole the rest. And now he was back, hungover and hollow, looking for a refund. "He's back," Caleb growled, the vibration of his voice rattling the window pane. The rat came back for the cheese. Ada went pale. She scrambled into the corner, crouching behind the stack of firewood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He can't take me, she thought, panic rising like bile. I won't go back to the mud. I won't. Rourke! Caleb's voice boomed through the door, sudden and terrifying. Turn around. The snow's deep enough to bury you. Outside, the riders halted. Rourke laughed, a thin, reedy sound that carried on the wind. Thorn, Rourke screamed. I know you're in there. I heard you died. Folk in town said the winter took you. I came to collect my property. You sold her, Caleb roared. You took the gold. I sold a mule, Rourke shrieked, his voice cracking with greed. But I hear tell she ain't a mule. I hear tell you got her. Playing house, that makes her a wife, Thorn, and a wife costs more than 50 ounces, he signalled to the men behind him, hired toughs from the railhead, men with dead eyes and itchy fingers. And besides, Rourke yelled, drawing a long-barreled pistol. I spent the gold. I need a refill. Give us the cash, Thorn. We know you trappers keep the dust under the floor. Give us the gold and the girl, and we'll leave you the cabin. I have lead, Caleb said to the empty room. He can have that. He chambered around in the sharps. Clack thud. Last chance, Rourke. Burn him out, Rourke screamed. Light the roof. Smoke the bear. The world disintegrated. 6 rifles opened up at once. Bullets hammered the logs like hail. Wood splinters flew across the room, deadly as shrapnel. The window shutter, weathered by years of ice, disintegrated under a barrage of lead. A slug punched through a chink in the logs and slammed into the cast-iron pot on the stove with a deafening gong, spraying hot water across the floor. Caleb didn't flinch. He was no longer the tender nurse. He was the grizzly. He thrust the barrel of the sharps through the shattered window. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the rock face above them, where a shelf of wet, heavy snow was clinging by a thread. Boom. The heavy buffalo gun roared like a cannon. The recoil shoved Caleb backward, jarring his wounded side, but he grit his teeth. The bullet struck the rock. The vibration dislodged the snow. A sheet of white, tons of it, slid down the cliff face. It missed the men, but it spooked the horses. They reared, screaming, slipping in the mud. One rider was thrown, landing hard in the slush. Reloading, Caleb grunted, his hands a blur as he ejected the brass casing and shoved a fresh cartridge home. They're moving, Ada cried from the corner. She could hear them. To the side. The woodshed. Caleb swore. The woodshed was attached to the south wall. If they lit it, the whole cabin would go up. Stay down, he ordered. He rushed to the south wall looking for a firing port. There was none, just solid log. Outside, the whoosh of oil being thrown against wood was audible. Then the crackle, then the smell. Smoke began to curl under the doorframe, grey and acrid. Come out, Thorn, Rourke taunted, or cook in there. Caleb looked at Ada. She was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide, terrified. But she wasn't crying. She was looking around the room, looking for a weapon. I have to go out, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. I have to stop the fire. He grabbed his tomahawk from the wall. He checked the sharps. Bar the door behind me, he commanded. If anyone gets in, you kill them. You hear me, Ada? You kill them. Caleb, no, Ada gasped, standing up. Bar the door! Caleb kicked the bar up. He threw the door open. He stepped out into the smoke. He roared, a sound of pure, primal rage that drowned out the fire. He raised the sharps and fired from the hip, blowing a hole through the chest of the man holding the torch. The man crumpled, falling into the burning wood. Caleb dropped the empty rifle. He drew his tomahawk and his heavy hunting knife. He charged. He hit the posse like a landslide. He took a bullet in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he didn't stop. He buried the tomahawk in the leg of another man, dragging him from his saddle. It was chaos. Mud, blood, and fire. But inside the cabin, the war was different. Ada slammed the door and threw the heavy oak bar back into place. Her hands were shaking, but not with cold, with rage. She heard the screams outside. She heard Caleb grunting in pain. Then she heard a sound behind her. Scritch, crunch. The back window, the small one high up near the eaves, meant for ventilation. A face appeared there. A man with a scar across his nose and a knife between his teeth. He had climbed the woodpile. He smashed the glass with the hilt of his knife. He squeezed through the small opening, tumbling down onto the bed Caleb had given her. He rolled off the furs and landed on his feet, grinning. He held a long, curved skinning knife. Well now, the man sneered, spotting Ada by the door. Looks like the bear left the honey unguarded. Ada backed up until she hit the table. Her hand scrambled behind her, searching. "Don't you touch me," she whispered. "Rourke wants you back," the man laughed, stepping closer. "But he didn't say in what condition. I reckon I can break you in a little before we ride." He lunged. Ada didn't scream. She didn't faint. Her hand closed around the handle of the heavy cast-iron skillet sitting on the table, the one she had used to make Caleb's cornbread every morning. She didn't think. She reacted. 10 years of suppressed rage, 10 years of being called a mule, 10 years of swallowing her voice. It all exploded in a single motion. "I am no man's mule!" she screamed. She swung the skillet with both hands, putting every ounce of her frustration and strength into the blow. Clang! The sound was sickeningly loud, like a church bell ringing in hell. The heavy iron struck the man on the side of the head. It shattered his jaw. It turned his lights out instantly. He dropped like a sack of wet grain, the knife clattering across the floor. Ada stood over him, heaving, the skillet raised for a second strike. "Get up!" she shrieked at the unconscious man. "Get up and tell." "Me, I'm weak!" Outside, the gunfire stopped. The door rattled. "Ada!" It was Caleb's voice. "Open the door!" Ada lowered the skillet. She ran to the door, throwing the bar up. Caleb fell into the room. He was covered in mud and blood, mostly not his own, though his left shoulder was bleeding sluggishly. He looked wild, his eyes wide and frantic. He saw the man on the floor. He saw the blood pooling around his head. He saw the shattered window. Then he saw Ada. She was standing over the body. She was breathing hard, her hair wild, her apron dusted with flour and splattered with the intruder's blood. She was gripping the skillet so tight her knuckles were white. Caleb stared at her. He had left a victim in the cabin. He had returned to find a warrior. "He came through the window," Ada said, her voice trembling but fierce. "He said he was going to break me." She looked down at the man. "I broke him." Caleb limped toward her. He didn't look at the intruder. He looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, a fire he had helped kindle, but which was now burning with its own terrifying heat. "Is Rourke dead?" Ada asked, looking past him to the yard. "Not yet," Caleb growled, turning back to the door. "He ran. He's hiding in the rocks, but he's hurt." He reached out and gently took the skillet from her hand. He set it on the table, then he pulled his heavy Walker Colt revolver from his belt. He pressed it into her hand. It was warm from his body. "If he moves," Caleb said, pointing to the man on the floor, "you finish it. I have to end this." Ada wrapped both hands around the heavy grip of the gun. She looked Caleb in the eye. "Come back," she whispered. "I ain't leaving you," Caleb promised. "Not now. Not ever." He turned and walked back out into the smoke, not as a protector shielding a helpless woman, but as a partner clearing the field, for the life they were going to build. Gemini said. The smoke from the burning woodshed drifted across the yard in a lazy grey ribbon, stinging the back of Caleb's throat with the taste of pine pitch and the copper tang of spent gunpowder. The silence that had descended on the high Tetons was heavier than the blizzard had been. It pressed down on the valley, suffocating the roar of the creek and the wind in the pines. Caleb moved through the mud, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips to leave a dark, erratic trail in the slush. He stepped over the body of the torchbearer, his boots sinking deep into the churned earth. He wasn't hunting a man anymore. He was putting down a rabid animal. "Rourke!" Caleb bellowed. The sound cracked through the thin air, echoing off the granite cliffs like a judgment. "Don't make me track you. You're bleeding. I can smell it." A shuffle of shale from behind the horse trough gave him away. Caleb turned slowly, the heavy Sharp's rifle discarded, his hand resting on the hilt of his bowie knife. Jebediah Rourke was huddled in the dirt behind the trough, clutching his stomach. A stray bullet, or perhaps a splinter from the exploding wood, had caught him in the gut. He was pale, his face a mask of sweat and grime. The arrogance finally drained away to reveal the pathetic small man beneath. He looked up at Caleb. He saw the blood on Caleb's shirt. He saw the cold, dead light in the mountain man's eyes. Thorn. Rourke wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "It was business. Just business." "You came to my home," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Rourke's chest. "You fired on my woman." She's a mule," Rourke spat, a flicker of his old spite rising through the pain. "A Barren... useless..." Caleb didn't. Let him finish. He didn't draw the knife. He didn't need to. He stepped forward and kicked the pistol from Rourke's trembling hand. It skittered across the mud, useless. "She is a garden," Caleb whispered, looming over him like a falling tree. "And you are the blight." Rourke's eyes widened. He tried to scramble backward, but his legs wouldn't work. "Mercy, Thorn, I have gold. I have..." "You have nothing," Caleb said. He turned his back. He walked away. "Thorn!" Rourke screamed, realizing he was being left to the cold and the wound. "You can't leave me. It's murder." "It's winter cleanup," Caleb growled, not looking back. He walked to the cabin porch. He stopped to drag the unconscious intruder, the one Ada had broken with the skillet, out by his collar. He tossed him into the mud next to Rourke. "If you live," Caleb said to the groaning pile of men, "start walking. If you don't, the wolves need to eat too." He slammed the door, sealing out the world, the war, and the dead. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the embers of the fire and the grey light filtering through the shattered window. Ada was standing by the table, the heavy Walker Colt still gripped in both hands, pointed at the door. When she saw it was him, she lowered the gun, her knees giving way. She sank onto the bench, the adrenaline crashing out of her system and leaving her shaking like a leaf. Caleb limped to the hearth. He dropped the bar across the door, a finality. He turned to her. He looked at the flower on her apron, now stained with blood. He looked at the fierce set of her jaw that was softening into relief. He tried to take a step toward her, but the room spun. The blood loss from his shoulder was catching. Up to him, he stumbled, catching himself on the back of the chair. "Caleb!" Ada was there in a second. She dropped the gun and grabbed his good arm, guiding him to the stool. "I'm fine," he lied, his face gray. "Just a scratch." "Sit," Ada commanded, her voice finding that steel edge again. "You're bleeding all over my clean floor." She went to work. She wasn't the trembling victim of the auction block. She was the woman who had nursed him through the cougar fever. She cut away his shirt with the shears. She fetched the hot water and the calendula salve. She cleaned the bullet furrow in his deltoid, deep and ugly, but it had missed the bone. Caleb sat still, watching her hands. They were rough, red and scarred, but they moved with a tenderness that made his chest ache. When she finished binding the wound, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It will heal," she said softly. "But you'll have another scar." Caleb looked at her. He looked at the cabin, the shattered window, the blood on the floor, the soot stains on the ceiling. He stood up, swaying slightly. He walked to the hearth. He pried up the loose stone where he kept the rest of his cash. He pulled out the heavy leather bag, the one with the rest of his life's savings. He carried it to the table and set it down with a heavy thud. "Take it," Caleb rasped. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Ada froze. "What?" "The pass is open," Caleb said, his voice hard and flat, trying to crush the hope in his own heart before it could kill him. "Rourke is done, but there will be others." Men like that. They smell happiness and they come to burn it down. He pushed the bag toward her. Take the gold. Take the Percheron. Ride to the railhead. Go to San Francisco. Find a city where the streets are paved and the men wear silk suits. He turned to look at her then, and the misery in his eyes was bottomless. You've proven you ain't a mule, Ada. You're a queen. And queens don't belong in bear caves. They don't belong with men who bring war to their doorstep. He gestured to the door. Go, find a soft man. A man who can give you a house that doesn't smell of blood. Ada stared at the gold. She looked at the door. Then she looked at Caleb. She stood up. She walked to the table. She picked up the heavy bag of gold dust. She walked to the door. Caleb watched her, his heart shattering in his chest. It's right, he told himself. She deserves safety. She deserves life. Ada unbarred the door. She opened it. She stepped out onto the porch. She swung her arm. Whoosh! She hurled the bag of gold into the deep snow of the ravine. It disappeared with a soft flump, buried instantly. Caleb's jaw dropped. Woman! That was a fortune! Ada turned around. She walked back inside. She slammed the door and threw the bar. She walked up to him, invading his space, forcing him to look down at her. I don't want silk, she whispered, her voice trembling with fury and love. I wore wool that smelled of dead men for 10 years. I don't want soft. Soft men watched me get beaten. Soft men laughed when I was sold. She reached up and took his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the scars that ran through his beard. I want the iron, Caleb. I want the man who threw 50 ounces of gold in the mud just to stop me from crying. I want the man who covered me with his own coat in a blizzard. She pressed her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. You think you bring war? She asked softly. Caleb, until I met you, my whole life was a war. You didn't bring it. You ended it. Caleb stood frozen. He felt the heat of her skin. He felt the steady beat of her heart against his ribs. But I can't give you... He choked on the words. The garden. Rourke said you were barren. I said you weren't. But what if I'm the salt, Ada? What if I'm too broken to grow anything? Ada looked up at him. Her eyes were fierce, dry, and burning with certainty. Then we plant again, she whispered. And again. And again. Until something takes root. She kissed his scars. She kissed the jagged line on his cheek. She kissed the rough skin of his neck. I am not a mule, she breathed against his skin. I am your wife, and I am staying right here. Caleb broke. A sound that was half sob, half laugh ripped out of his chest. He wrapped his good arm around her, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck. He held her with a desperation that shook them both. My wife, he groaned. My Ada. He carried her to the bed he had slept on the floor. Beside for months. He laid her down among the furs. I vow to you, he whispered, hovering over her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, holy light. I will fill this house. I will fill every empty corner. You will never be barren again. Epilogue. 1 year later. The summer sun in the Teton Range was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the alpine meadow behind the cabin into a riot of wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and fireweed. The cabin had changed. The shattered window was replaced with clear glass that sparkled in the light. A new room had been added to the side, built of fresh, golden pine logs. The woodshed was rebuilt, bigger than before, and stacked high with seasoned timber. On the porch, a rocking chair creaked rhythmically. Creak thud, creak thud. Ada sat in the chair. She wore a dress of soft blue calico, clean and fitted. Her hair was braided back, shining like spun gold in the sun. Her face was fuller, flushed with health, the hollows of hunger gone forever, but her arms were not empty. She held a bundle wrapped in a soft white wool blanket, wool that she had spun herself. The door opened. Caleb stepped out. He moved quietly, Now the heavy stomp of the solitary trapper, replaced by the careful tread of a father. He was shirtless, sweat glistening on his shoulders from splitting wood, the scar on his arm a silver line of history. He walked to the chair. He knelt down in the dust. He reached out a massive finger, a finger that could crush a man's windpipe, and gently touched the cheek of the infant sleeping in Ada's arms. The baby stirred. A tiny hand, pink and perfect, reached out and grasped Caleb's finger. A boy. He had Caleb's dark hair and Ada's mouth. "He's strong," Caleb whispered, his voice full of wonder. "Look at that grip. He'll hold a hammer before he can walk." "He's hungry," Ada smiled, shifting the baby. "Just like his father." Caleb looked at Ada. He looked at the son she had given him. He looked at the garden patch near the creek, where rows of hearty potatoes and carrots were pushing up through the black earth. The curse of Barren felt like a bad dream from another life. Jebediah Rourke was a ghost, buried under a year of snow. The mud of Purgatory Creek was a world away. Caleb leaned forward and kissed Ada, then kissed the forehead of his son. "I told you," he murmured, resting his head against her knee. "It wasn't the land, Ada. It was just the gardener." Ada ran her hand through his hair, looking out at the peaks that sheltered them. "The harvest is good, Caleb," she whispered. "The harvest is good." High above them, an eagle screamed, diving into the valley, free and wild, just like the family that had carved a home out of the rock and proved that even in the coldest winter, love could still bloom.